Most serial killers in the world are men, but today's story is about a female serial killer. And she's no ordinary woman, she's the kind of person who'd say to the devil, "Come, let me teach you a thing or two." She went from being an average person to a criminal. She started with armed robberies, then moved on to thefts, and eventually to luring and killing men to rob them. She killed 7 men in ways that, once you hear about them, will make your hair stand on end. I'm sure this story will grab your attention, so focus on the details and stay tuned for the full video. Enjoy watching, and don't forget to hit the like button. December 29, 1956. In the state of Michigan, USA, Aileen Wuornos was born, one of the most violent serial killers you'll ever hear about. When her mother gave birth to her, she was just 16 years old and couldn't raise her. So, as is often done in America, she handed her over to her grandparents to raise her. But instead of raising her, they got creative with their ways of torturing her. Her grandfather had a sauna at home, and if she did anything he didn't like, they'd lock her in the sauna and crank up the heat. And that's just one of many ways they abused her. From a young age, she developed a deep hatred for men, a hatred that would become very clear with time. When she turned 14, she started hanging out with some friends who led her astray and introduced her to a bad lifestyle. A year later, her grandfather kicked her out of the house, and she had no choice but to live in a forest near their home. Imagine a 15-year-old girl, living alone in the woods. Life was incredibly tough for her. But somehow, she managed to survive for a whole year in that forest. At 16, the situation became unbearable. So, she packed up and left, traveling to the state of Colorado. And here's where things start to get really interesting, so pay attention. 2 years later, she was arrested for the first time. The charge? Driving under the influence of alcohol. She also had a .22 caliber gun with her and tried to shoot at someone passing by. The court sentenced her to 4 years in prison. By the time she turned 20, she decided to change her life and moved to Florida. While there, she met a man named Lewis, and they fell in love, even though he was 70 years old. But since he was wealthy, it's pretty obvious why she fell for him. The real problem in their story wasn't the age gap, though. The issue was that Aileen was incredibly violent with her husband. It said that she used to beat him with the cane he relied on to walk. Poor man, he must have suffered a lot. A few weeks into their marriage, Aileen and Lewis split up, each going their own way. Aileen had an older brother, just a year older than her, but their relationship was terrible. Shortly after her divorce, she received news that her brother had died. Along with that news came a $10,000 inheritance. This amount was more than enough for her to start her new business, armed robbery. Aileen bought herself a gun and picked her first robbery target, but it was a really dumb target. She went to a small market and tried to steal 35 packs of cigarettes. Unfortunately for her, the robbery was a complete failure. She got caught and sentenced to a year in prison. One time, she even saw a man walking down the street, pulled her gun on him, and robbed him of $200. Aileen was willing to do anything to get money. After getting out of prison for the second time, she met a girl at a pool hall who became her best friend. Her name was Tyria Moore. The two of them started working together on small-time robberies, slowly collecting money. But then Aileen told Tyria, "Let's level up our game. I'm done with these lame, low-pay robberies." And so, on November 30, 1989, they made their move on their first victim. Here was the plan. They'd stand on the side of a road, flag down a car with a man driving alone, ask him for a ride, and play friendly until they struck. On their first try, they found the perfect target. A man named Richard Mallory, 51 years old, who had recently divorced his wife, saw the two women waving and pulled over to pick them up. He let both Aileen and Tyria into his car. They chatted, got comfortable, and then, just minutes later, Aileen pulled out her gun. She shot him 4 times, took all his money and belongings, then dumped his body in a remote area and fled the scene. 2 weeks later, authorities found his body, mostly decomposed. It was clear he'd been robbed and then murdered, but with no leads, the investigation stalled. 6 months after killing Richard, they used the same strategy again. Standing on the side of the road, waiting for another lone driver. This time, it didn't take long. Their next victim was David Spears, a 43-year-old man who stopped to give them a ride. They started talking, getting to know each other, and within minutes, Aileen pulled her gun. She shot him 6 times. When David's family realized something was wrong, they immediately reported him missing. The next day, police found his car abandoned on the side of the road. Aileen's killing spree didn't stop there. She went on to kill 2 more men, both in the same way. Charles, 40 years old, Peter Smith, 65 years old. In both cases, she flagged them down, got into their car, and shot them after robbing them of everything she could take. Her pattern was clear, but for now, she continued to get away with it. After killing Peter, Aileen took his car, and she and her friend Tyria drove to a beach. During this time, Tyria was the one driving, but she wasn't a skilled driver. She ended up losing control of the car and flipping it on the side of the road. A passerby driving nearby noticed the accident and saw 2 women crawling out of the car before running away from the scene. Suspicious, he called the police and gave them the location. When the police arrived, they found the car, but it didn't have license plates because Aileen had removed and discarded them, along with any other evidence, in a nearby area. However, when investigators tracked the car through its serial number, they identified the owner as Peter Smith, who had been reported missing. What the investigators didn't know was that Aileen would commit 3 more murders while they were still piecing together the disappearances. On July 30, 1990, the 5th victim was a man named Troy Burress. Troy was a factory owner traveling to another state. While on the road, Aileen did what she usually did: she stopped him, got into his car, and shot him, killing him instantly. 5 days later, his body was discovered in a remote area and was later identified. Her 6th victim was Charles Humphreys, 56 years old. Just a month after her previous killing, Aileen struck again. What made this murder particularly shocking for investigators was that Charles was a retired police officer. She lured him just like her other victims, then killed him and robbed him. Finally, her 7th and last victim was Walter Gino, a deputy mayor of a county. She used the same method on him as well, ending his life and taking everything she could from him. Let's go back to Peter Smith's car accident. After questioning the witness at the scene, the police got a description of Aileen and Tyria. They created a composite sketch based on the witness's account and distributed it to detectives. One of them recognized the woman in the sketch as Aileen. Further investigation revealed that Aileen was often spotted in areas where the victims had disappeared, confirming that all the murders were connected and pointing to a single killer. The case had become clear, but now the priority was to find her. Detectives discovered that Aileen frequently visited biker bars. They distributed officers across these bars, hoping to catch her. The breakthrough came when an officer named Mike found her at one of the suspected bars. However, Mike knew that if Aileen realized he was a cop, she'd bolt immediately. So, he kept his distance and observed her for 3 days, slowly gaining her trust. He introduced himself, got to know her, and even managed to become friends with her. The police decided not to arrest her inside the bar to avoid endangering any of the patrons. They waited patiently for the perfect moment to make their move. On the 3rd day, Officer Mike arranged to take Aileen for a walk on the beach, and she agreed. The police plan was to arrest her as soon as she left the bar. Mike wasn't planning to stray too far with her, though. He was genuinely worried she might do to him what she did to her previous victims and make him victim number 8. Sure enough, the moment she stepped outside the bar, the police arrested her and took her in for questioning. Shortly after, they located her friend Tyria and arrested her as well. The investigators offered Tyria a deal: help us with evidence against Aileen, and we'll grant you immunity from prosecution. Without hesitation, Tyria betrayed Aileen and told the police everything. When the interrogation began, Aileen was surprisingly cooperative. She said, "First, I don't need a lawyer. Second, all 7 missing men. I killed them. And the reason? I was always drunk and out of control. Let me give you some advice: execute me, because if I get out of prison, I'll go right back to doing what I was doing." Aileen was eventually sentenced to 6 death penalties, 1 for each of the 6 victims whose bodies had been found. You might wonder, but she killed 7 victims. Why only 6 death sentences? The reason is that Peter Smith's body was never found. Without his remains, they couldn't try her for his murder, even though she confessed. After spending 10 years on death row, Aileen was executed in 2002 by lethal injection. And that marked the end of one of the world's most infamous female serial killers. Her story is a harsh reminder of what neglect and abuse can do to a child. Aileen grew up channeling her anger and trauma into violence, trying to feel powerful. Her mother abandoned her, and her grandparents subjected her to years of abuse. This isn't an excuse for her crimes, but it's clear that had she been raised in a stable, loving environment, her story might have been completely different. A movie was made about Eileen's life, but it takes a lot of liberties with the truth. And with that, we've reached the end of our story.